Jedediah Stone felt the ache of winter in his knuckles. In his high mountain cabin, the fire was his only companion. He had to patch the tear in his heavy wolfskin coat before the first deep snow, but his fingers, stiff and clumsy, refused to guide the fine needle. Without a sound coat, a trip for supplies would be impossible, and an empty larder meant a slow, quiet end. He set the needle down with a sigh, the small piece of steel seeming to mock him from the rough-hewn table. The cabin was a small world of his own making, smelling of pine smoke, dried herbs, and old leather. For 20 years, this solitude had been a comfort, a shield against a world that moved too fast and talked too much. Now it was just a quiet room where his own body was beginning to fail him in small, insistent ways. The coat lay across his lap, a relic of a younger man's strength. The tear along the shoulder seam was wide, a gaping mouth that would welcome the wind. He had tried for an hour, his frustration growing with each failed attempt to thread the needle. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls, making the small space feel both warm and profoundly lonely. He knew what he had to do. The journey down to Three Forks Crossing was a 2-day walk, a journey he made only twice a year. But the coat was not a luxury. It was the difference between life and a frozen death on the trail. He stood, his joints protesting, and began to pack a small satchel. A little jerky, a water skin, and his sharpest skinning knife. The trip would be hard, but staying here with a useless coat would be harder. The mountains demanded respect, and going into winter unprepared was the highest form of disrespect. His decision was made. There was a woman at the trading post, Sarah Miller, who had a deft hand with a needle. He would trade a few good pelts for her time and skill. It was a simple transaction, a brief intersection with the world of others before he retreated back to his silence. But as he looked at the coat, a deeper unease settled in his stomach. It felt like admitting defeat, not to the mountain, but to time itself. Anyone listening in the dark feels the stove warmth hold steady. He banked the fire, pulled on his worn boots, and stepped out into the sharp, clean air of late autumn. The descent would begin at dawn. He was just a man going to town for a simple repair, nothing more. The thought was a comfort, a small, smooth stone he could hold in his mind. But the mountain path had a way of changing a man's plans, and a simple transaction often became tangled in the lives of others. The journey down was a conversation with the land he knew better than any person. He followed the familiar game trails, his feet finding their rhythm on the pine needle floor. The air grew thicker, warmer, as he lost elevation. The aspens were a blaze of gold, their leaves trembling in the slight breeze like 1,000 tiny coins. By the second afternoon, he could smell the wood smoke from the settlement, a scent different from his own fire, mixed with the smell of cook fires, livestock, and damp earth. Three Forks Crossing wasn't much of a town. It was a trading post, a blacksmith, and a handful of cabins clustered where 2 creeks met a larger river. It was a place of necessity, not ambition. As he approached, he saw a small group of people gathered outside the trading post, their voices low and tense. He recognized Elias Thorne, the post's owner, a fair man with a perpetually worried brow. He also saw Silas Blackwood, a trapper whose ambition always seemed to sour his face. In the center of the group, looking small and pale, stood Samuel Miller and his wife, Sarah. Their young son, Leo, clung to his mother's skirt, his eyes wide. Jed slowed his pace, preferring not to walk into the middle of a dispute. He was here for a needle and thread, not for trouble. He leaned against a tall pine at the edge of the clearing, his presence going unnoticed. Silas was speaking, his voice a low growl that carried in the still air. 3 of my traps gone, and the beaver pelts with them. I followed the tracks right back to your claim, Miller. Samuel Miller shook his head, his hands held up in a gesture of peace. I don't know anything about your traps, Silas. We've been clearing land for a winter pasture, that's all. We haven't been near the creek, Blackwood scoffed. Clearing land? Or clearing out my livelihood? Everyone knows you folks are struggling. Desperate people do desperate things. A murmur went through the small crowd. Jed saw the looks, the quick, judging glances at the Millers' worn clothes and their sons' patched trousers. The Millers were newcomers, having arrived last spring with little more than a wagon and a dream of farming the small parcel of land upriver. They had not yet earned the trust that came with shared winters and mutual hardship. Elias Thorne stepped forward. Now, Silas, that's a heavy accusation. Do you have proof? The proof is the empty space where my trap should be, and the footprints leading to his property line, Elias. That's proof enough for me. Silas spat on the ground. Jed watched Sarah Miller's face. She didn't look defiant or angry. She looked tired, and a deep, weary sadness radiated from her. This was not the first time their poverty had been used as a weapon against them. He had only wanted his coat mended. Now he was a witness to an accusation that could shatter a family's future in a place like this. A reputation for theft, even unproven, was a sentence of isolation and ruin. The transaction he had planned suddenly felt impossibly complicated. To ask for help from a woman being publicly shamed felt like taking a side, and Jedediah had not taken a side in anything for 20 years. The crowd dispersed slowly, leaving the Millers standing alone in the fading light. Elias gave them a sympathetic nod before retreating into his store. Silas Blackwood shot one last venomous glare their way before stomping off toward his own cabin. Jed waited until they were truly alone before he moved from the shadow of the trees. He approached them slowly, his heavy coat over his arm. Samuel saw him first and stiffened, expecting another accuser. "Ma'am," Jed said, his voice rusty from disuse. He nodded at Sarah. "I heard you have a good hand with a needle. My coat has a tear that my own fingers are too old to manage. I have some fine fox pelts to trade for your time." Sarah looked from Jed's face to the coat, then to her husband. Her eyes were clouded with suspicion. "Why ask me? There are other women here." Jed met her gaze directly. "Because I've seen the blankets you weave, and I know good work when I see it." It was true. He had seen one of her blankets in the trading post last year, a simple but beautifully crafted piece that spoke of patience and skill. Sarah's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of pride in her tired eyes. She took the coat from him, her fingers tracing the torn seam. "This is thick hide. It will take a strong needle and good sinew." "I have both," Jed said. He unrolled his pack and presented 3 perfect red fox pelts, their fur thick and glossy. More than fair for the work. Samuel stepped forward. "We can't take that, mister. Not with things as they are. People will talk." "Let them," Jed said. "A fair trade is a fair trade. It has nothing to do with Silas Blackwood's missing traps." His words hung in the air, a clear statement. He was not one of the accusers. A visible wave of relief passed over Samuel. Sarah nodded once, a small, sharp movement. "I can have it done by morning." She took the pelts and the coat, her shoulders a little less slumped than before. Jed took a room at the trading post, a small space above the main store that Elias kept for travelers. He could hear the low murmur of voices from below as men gathered around the stove, chewing over the day's events. The truth is often quieter than the gossip that surrounds it. Jed knew the accusation against Miller felt wrong. It was too simple, too convenient. Silas Blackwood was a man who enjoyed seeing others fail, and the Millers were an easy target. As Jed lay on the narrow cot, he thought about the tracks Silas claimed to have followed. Any man who lived in these mountains knew that tracks could be misleading. They told a story, but not always the whole story. He had come down the mountain to solve a small problem of his own. Now a much larger one had settled at his feet, and he felt a reluctant stirring of duty. He decided then, in the quiet of the rented room, that he would walk the trap line himself come morning. He wouldn't be looking for beaver. He would be looking for the truth. An old trapper's code was simple. You did not steal from another man's line. But a deeper code, the mountain's code, demanded you seek the facts before passing judgment. Morning came with a pale, gray light. Jed was up before the sun, sipping a cup of hot coffee Elias had left on the stove. He saw Sarah Miller through the window, already sitting on her cabin's porch, the heavy coat in her lap, her needle working with a steady, rhythmic motion. She had not waited for the sun to be fully risen. She was a woman who understood the value of work. Jed left the trading post quietly and headed upriver, following the path toward the Miller and Blackwood claims. The air was cold and still. The ground was soft from a recent rain, perfect for holding tracks. He found Silas's trap line easily enough. The man was skilled but not subtle, his markers clear to anyone who knew what to look for. The first 2 trap locations were empty, just as Silas had said. The ground around them was disturbed, but the tracks were a muddy confusion of boot prints. Silas had clearly spent a lot of time here, stomping around and cursing his luck. It was at the third location that Jed found something that made him stop. The trap was gone, but beside the deep impression it had left in the mud, there was another set of tracks. They were not Samuel Miller's worn-out work boots. Jed had noticed Miller's boots yesterday. The left one had a distinctive worn patch on the heel. These prints were different. They were smaller, neater, and made by newer boots with a sharp, clear tread. He followed the new tracks away from the creek. They didn't lead toward the Miller homestead. They led deeper into the woods toward the rocky bluffs that marked the edge of the valley. This was wrong. A poacher would follow the creek, staying low and out of sight, moving quickly from trap to trap. A poacher would not head into the difficult, exposed terrain of the bluffs. Jed crouched, examining the earth. He saw where a branch had been snapped, where a stone had been overturned. The person who made these tracks was moving carefully, but they didn't have the ingrained quiet of a man who lived his life in the wild. They were a town dweller or someone who spent more time on cleared paths than on hidden trails. The story was changing with every step he took. The evidence of the land rarely lies, even when people do. Silas Blackwood had told a story that fit his anger, but the earth was beginning to tell a different one. Jed followed the tracks for another hour as they climbed higher. The trail grew faint on the rocky ground, but his eyes were accustomed to finding the slightest sign. A scuff mark here, a dislodged pebble there. The trail ended abruptly at the base of a sheer rock face, near the mouth of a narrow cave. Outside the cave, partially hidden under a pile of loose rocks, he found it. The missing trap. It wasn't empty. It was broken. The steel jaws were bent, and the trigger mechanism was smashed as if someone had repeatedly slammed it with a heavy rock. No trapper would do this. A stolen trap was one thing, a valuable tool that could be reused. A destroyed trap was an act of pure malice, or something else entirely. It made no sense. Why would a thief take the time to destroy what he had stolen? Jed looked closer at the trap. It was a newer model, the kind with a powerful double spring. The trading post ledger shows 3 names from last winter who bought traps like that, Ilias had told him. But Blackwood was the only one who bought this specific brand. This confirmed it was Silas's property. He peered into the dark mouth of the cave. A faint, musky smell emanated from within. Bear, and a big one, by the scent. A thought began to form in his mind. A news story that fit the facts better than Silas's tale of simple theft. He didn't enter the cave. He was not a fool. Instead, he backed away slowly and circled around, climbing the bluff from a safer angle until he was positioned above the cave's entrance. From there, he could see the surrounding area clearly. He saw the creek below, a silver ribbon winding through the valley. He saw the Miller homestead, a small scar of cleared land and a thin plume of smoke rising from the chimney. And he saw something else. Downstream from where the traps had been set, a section of the beaver dam had been destroyed. It wasn't the work of a flood. The logs were cut and pushed aside with deliberate force. Someone had intentionally drained the pond. Now the pieces began to fit. The broken trap, the drained pond, the bear den. It wasn't about stolen pelts at all. It was about the water. Someone wanted the creek to run low. Anyone who has ever solved a puzzle knows the feeling of one piece clicking into place. The whole picture was not yet clear, but its edges were beginning to form. Jed understood that the missing beavers were not the motive. They were a casualty. Destroying the dam would have scattered the beavers, making them easy prey or simply driving them off. The empty traps were a consequence, not the cause of the conflict. The real crime was the broken dam, and Silas Blackwood, in his anger over his lost income, had missed the larger truth. He had blamed the most convenient person, the poor newcomer, because it was the easiest story to believe. Jed made his way back down the bluff, his mind working. The broken trap in the bear's den was a strange piece of the puzzle. Perhaps the person who destroyed the dam had been surprised by the bear and dropped the trap in their haste to escape. It was a plausible theory, but it didn't explain everything. Who would want to drain the beaver pond, and why? The creek flowed from the high mountains, passing through Blackwood's trapping grounds and then across the corner of the Miller's property before joining the main river. The water was life here. It was used for drinking, for livestock, and for the small gardens people tried to coax from the rocky soil. To interfere with it was a serious offense, far more serious than poaching. Jed returned to Three Forks Crossing as the sun was setting. The air was filled with the smell of cooking fires. He saw Sarah Miller on her porch, holding up his coat. The seam was mended, the stitches small and even, stronger than the original. She had done a master's work. He walked over, feeling the weight of the knowledge he now carried. He handed her another fox pelt, a finer one than the others. For the speed and the skill, he said. Sarah tried to refuse, but he insisted. Good work should be rewarded. Samuel came out of the cabin, his face etched with worry. Did you have a good walk, mister? I did, Jed replied. The mountains are quiet today. He met Samuel's eyes. It's often the quietest places where you learn the most. He didn't say more. It wasn't time yet. He needed more than just a theory. He needed proof that was as solid as the mountains themselves. He went to the trading post. Elias was behind the counter, tallying his accounts in a large ledger. The light from the lantern cast a warm glow on his face. Jed bought a few supplies, flour, salt, coffee. Then he leaned on the counter. Elias, he said in a low voice, do you keep records of the old claims filed in this area? Elias looked up, surprised. I have the county plat book. It's years out of date, but it shows the original land grants and mining claims. Why do you ask? There is something out of place up on the creek, Jed said simply, and I have a feeling the answer is in old paper, not in new gossip. Elias nodded slowly, his expression serious. He trusted Jedediah Stone. The old mountain man did not speak idly. He pulled a heavy, leather-bound book from under the counter and laid it open. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in faded ink and the careful drawings of surveyors from a forgotten time. They bent over the book together, the lantern light illuminating a map of the land that held secrets neither of them yet understood. The map was a spiderweb of lines showing property boundaries, river courses, and old mineral claims. Jed ran his finger along the line of the creek that flowed past the miller's property. He followed it upstream, past Blackwood's trapping area, into the high country. And there it was, a small square marked on the map, right over the area where the beaver dam had been. The label was written in a cramped, elegant script. Silver Queen Claim, filed 1859. Unproductive. Unproductive. A failed silver mine. Most of the men who had rushed to these mountains seeking their fortune had found nothing but hardship. Their abandoned claims littered the hillsides, monuments to broken dreams. But why would a failed claim from 20 years ago have anything to do with a broken beaver dam today? Jed stared at the map, a nagging thought at the back of his mind. He had seen something near the bluffs earlier, something he had dismissed as unimportant at the time. A set of freshly cut survey stakes, nearly hidden in the undergrowth. Someone was remarking the boundaries of that old claim. Elias, Jed said, has anyone been in here asking about this old claim? Buying mining equipment, maybe? Elias stroked his beard, thinking. Now that you mention it, yes. A man from Denver was here about a month ago, a fancy fellow in city clothes. He bought a new pickaxe and a shovel. Said he was a geologist, just looking at rock formations. The crate the tools came in bears a mine mark that matches the seal on some of Blackwood's new gear. The pieces were falling together now, forming a picture that was both clearer and more dangerous. The geologist, the new survey stakes, the drained pond. The Silver Queen claim may have been deemed unproductive in 1859, but perhaps new techniques or new knowledge had changed that. If someone believed there was silver in that bluff, they would need to get at the rock. The beaver pond was in the way, flooding the base of the bluff and making any mining operation impossible. Draining the pond was the first logical step. Suddenly, Silas Blackwood's angry accusations seemed like a smokescreen. A convenient distraction created by a man who had been manipulated or who was actively participating in a larger deception. The light of understanding dawned on Jed's face. Blackwood wasn't the victim of poaching. He was a pawn, or worse, a partner in a scheme to defraud the Millers. The creek and the water rights that came with it flowed through their land. The land deed carries an old stamp, Jed murmured, pointing at the map. That means the water rights are attached to the Miller property, not the mining claim. Whoever wants that silver would need access to the water, and they would need the Millers out of the way. Accusing Samuel of being a thief was the perfect way to turn the community against him, to make him an outcast, to force him to sell his land cheap and leave the valley in shame. It was a cold and calculated plan. Elias looked up from the map, his face grim. Silas has been spending a lot of money lately, he said quietly. More than a trapper ought to have. Paid off his account here in cash last week. Gold coin, not paper. Jed nodded. The geologist from Denver likely paid him well to cause trouble, to be the local face of the dispute. They needed a villain, and Silas played the part perfectly. Now Jed had the full story, but it was a story built on his own observations and deductions. He had tracks, a broken trap, and an old map. It was not enough. He needed something to tie Silas directly to the destruction of the dam. He thanked Elias and left the trading post, his mended coat slung over his shoulder. The night was cold and the stars were brilliant in the black sky. He walked not toward his rented room, but back toward the miller's cabin. He found Samuel outside, splitting firewood by moonlight, his movements filled with a tense, angry energy. Jed approached him quietly. "Miller, I need to ask you something. When you were clearing your land, did you see anything unusual up by the creek? Anything at all?" Samuel stopped, leaning on his axe. He looked at Jed, his eyes full of suspicion. "Why are you so interested in this?" Jed met his gaze. "Because I don't believe you're a thief, and I believe you and your family are in more trouble than you know. Sometimes the only way to earn trust is to offer it first, without condition." Jed was offering his, and waiting to see if it would be accepted. Samuel Miller stared at Jedediah for a long moment, the moonlight catching the lines of worry on his face. He finally gave a slow nod and leaned the axe against the woodpile. "A few days ago," he said, his voice low, "I was clearing brush near my property line. I saw Silas up by the dam. I thought he was just checking his traps, so I didn't pay him any mind. But he wasn't just checking them. He had an axe. I heard chopping. I figured he was clearing a deadfall or something. It didn't seem important at the time." "Did you see what he was chopping?" Jed asked, keeping his own voice calm. "No. I was too far away and the trees were in the way. But it went on for a while. A lot of chopping. Then it stopped. A little while later I heard him yelling and cursing from up the creek. I guess that's when he found his traps were empty. He didn't know it, but Samuel had just provided the final piece. Silas wasn't the victim. He had destroyed the dam himself, then created a public spectacle over his empty traps to deflect suspicion and point the finger at Miller. It was a cruel and clever plan. Jedediah explained his theory to Samuel, laying out the evidence piece by piece. The old mining claim, the geologist from Denver, the survey stakes, the tracks that led away from the Miller homestead, the deliberately broken trap, and Elias's observation about Silas's sudden wealth. As he spoke, Samuel's expression shifted from weary defensiveness to dawning horror, and then to a slow-burning anger. "He's trying to steal my land," Samuel whispered. "That's what this is all about. He wants my water." "Yes," Jed said, "but we can't prove it with just my word and your story. We need something more. We need to find the tool he used on that dam." The next morning, Jed and Samuel went to the creek. Sarah insisted on coming, her face set with a quiet determination. Even young Leo tagged along, his usual boyish energy replaced by a solemn watchfulness. They walked to the broken dam. The damage was plain to see in the daylight. The main support logs had been chopped through with a powerful axe. The cuts were fresh, the raw wood bright against the dark, water-stained bark of the logs. Jed knelt and examined the cuts. "This was done with a sharp, heavy axe," he said, "and the person using it left a distinct mark." He pointed to a small, deep nick in the wood at the end of each cut. It was a flaw in the axe blade itself, a signature left behind at the scene of the crime. Every tool, like every person, has its imperfections, and sometimes those imperfections are what reveal the truth. Jed knew that a man's axe was as personal as his signature. "Now we need to see Silas Blackwood's axe," Jed said. Samuel looked grim. "He won't just let us walk up and inspect it." "No," Jed agreed, "but a man like Silas Blackwood will not be moved by reason when greed has taken root. He will only be moved by force or by fear. We will not use force." Jed looked at Samuel, his eyes calm and steady. "So we will use fear." He explained his plan, not a plan of confrontation in a crowded town, but one of quiet pressure, a hunter's plan. They would not sneak into his cabin. They would walk to his door in the light of day. They waited until the next morning, when the sun was high and the shadows were short. There was nowhere to hide. Jedediah walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who owned his time. Samuel walked beside him, his fear a tight knot in his stomach, but he drew strength from the old man's composure. They did not knock on Silas Blackwood's door. Jed simply pushed it open and stepped inside. Silas was at his table, cleaning a rifle, the metallic scrape of the cleaning rod echoing in the small space. He looked up, his face darkening with surprise and anger. "What do you want, old man?" "Get off my property." Jed ignored him. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the disorder, the unwashed plates, the pile of pelts in the corner. His gaze came to rest on a new axe leaning against the wall by the hearth. The blade was clean, recently sharpened. "I know what you did, Silas," Jed said, his voice a low rumble, as steady as the mountain stones. Silas stood up, knocking his chair over. He set the rifle down, but kept his hand near it. "You know nothing. You're a crazy hermit who's been alone too long. I know about the Silver Queen claim," Jed continued, his voice unchanged. "I know about the man from Denver. I know he paid you in gold coin to drive the Millers off their land so he could get their water." The color drained from Blackwood's face. His bluster evaporated, replaced by the sharp, feral look of a cornered animal. It was a lie. He was a liar. Jed took a step forward, his eyes never leaving Silas's. "And I know about your axe. I saw the cuts on the damn logs. They have a signature, a small nick in the blade. The same nick that is on the blade of that new axe right there." He did not need to inspect it. The certainty in his voice was enough. He was not guessing. He was stating a fact of the earth. Silas's hand twitched toward the rifle. That's when the cabin door opened again. A man stood there dressed in clean, city clothes that looked out of place in the rustic cabin. He was lean and pale, with intelligent eyes that held no warmth. He looked at Jed and Samuel, then at Silas's panicked face. "Trouble, Silas," the man said, his voice smooth and calm. "It seems you have been careless." This must be the geologist, Samuel thought, his heart sinking. The man from Denver. "Let's call him Mr. Finch." Finch stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Gentlemen," he said with a thin smile, "I believe you are trespassing, and I believe you are attempting to steal a man's land," Jed countered, his voice losing none of its quiet power. Finch's smile did not waver, an interesting accusation. "But it is your word against ours. The word of a failed farmer and a mountain ghost? Who do you think the good people of Three Forks Crossing will believe?" "They will believe the truth," Samuel said, finding his voice, "when we show them the proof." Finch chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Ah, but that is the problem, Mr. Miller. You see, you will not be showing anyone anything." In his hand, almost appearing from nowhere, was a small, deadly pistol. Silas, relieved and emboldened, grabbed his rifle from the table. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted from tense confrontation to imminent violence. "Our little business venture requires a certain amount of discretion," Finch said calmly. "A tragic accident, I think. A prospecting trip gone wrong up on the bluffs. Such a shame. 2 men lost to the mountain they thought they knew. There was no escape. They were marched out of the cabin at gunpoint, Finch's small pistol pressed against Jed's back, Silas's rifle covering Samuel. They were forced up the trail away from the town, toward the high bluffs and the old Silver Queen claim. The sun was warm on Jed's back, and the air was filled with the scent of pine. He felt no fear, only a deep, cold anger. He had lived his life by the mountain's rules of respect and balance. These men knew only the rule of greed, a rule that saw the land and its people as things to be broken and consumed. As they climbed, Jed's mind was not on the pistol at his back, but on the path ahead. He was on his own ground now. Finch and Silas thought they were leading him to his death. They did not understand that they were walking deeper into his world, a world whose secrets they could not begin to fathom. He remembered the trail he had followed just days before. He remembered the tracks, the broken trap, and the cave. He remembered the musky scent of bear. The cave was not far from the old mining claim. A new plan began to form in his mind, a dangerous and desperate plan, but one that obeyed the laws of the mountain. They reached the base of the bluffs where the abandoned Silver Queen claim was located, a shallow shaft, little more than a hole in the rock face, marked the failed dreams of earlier men. "This will do," Finch said, gesturing with his pistol. "A convenient place for a rock slide." Silas grinned, his confidence restored. He shoved Samuel toward the mine entrance. Jed stood still. He turned his head slowly and looked at Finch. "You are making a mistake," he said. Finch raised an eyebrow. "I assure you, old man, the only mistake here was your decision to interfere." "The mountain does not care about your pieces of paper," Jed said, his gaze sweeping over the bluffs. "It does not care about your silver, but it protects its own." Finch scoffed. "Empty words. Silas, get on with it." Silas raised the butt of his rifle to strike Samuel. In that instant, Jed acted. He did not lunge at Finch or Silas. He did something they could never have predicted. He let out a yell, a piercing, inhuman cry that was not born of fear, but of challenge. It was the cry of a predator, a sound that echoed off the rock face and tore through the quiet afternoon. Then he turned and ran. Not down the path, but sideways, scrambling over the rocks directly toward the place he had seen the cave. Finch and Silas were stunned for a second, caught off guard by the sheer unexpectedness of it. Silas fired his rifle, the shot cracking through the air, but Jed was already moving, his old body surprisingly agile on the familiar terrain. Samuel, seeing his chance, tackled Silas, and the two men went down in a desperate struggle. Finch, his composure finally broken, fired his pistol after Jed, the bullet whining off a rock near his head. Jed did not slow. He reached the narrow mouth of the cave and scrambled inside, plunging into the cool darkness. He could hear the heavy, huffing breath of a large animal disturbed from its sleep. The musky scent was overpowering. He pressed himself against the cold rock wall, his heart pounding, and waited. Outside, Finch had regained control. He kicked Samuel viciously, then stood over him. "You fool," he snarled at Silas, who was pulling himself to his feet. "He's trapped himself. Go in there and drag him out." Silas hesitated, peering at the dark opening. "There's something in there," he said, his trapper's instincts finally sounding an alarm. "I can smell it." "Get in there," Finch commanded, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Or I will leave you here with them." Goaded by the threat, Silas cautiously approached the cave, his rifle held ready. He poked his head inside. In the gloom, he could just make out Jed's shape against the far wall. He took a step inside, and then another. It was then that the cave's true inhabitant made its presence known. A deep, rumbling growl erupted from the darkness, a sound that vibrated in the very rock. A massive grizzly bear rose from its slumber, its form immense in the confined space. Silas had a moment of pure, undiluted terror. He tried to back away, to bring his rifle up, but it was too late. The bear was a force of nature, a blur of claws and fury. It struck Silas with a single devastating swipe of its paw, sending him crashing against the cave wall. His rifle clattered to the ground. Outside, Finch heard the terrible scream and the roar. He backed away from the cave mouth, his face a mask of horror. Jedediah, seeing his chance, slipped past the enraged bear, which was now fully focused on the threat that had invaded its den. He emerged from the cave, blinking in the sudden sunlight. Just as Samuel managed to get to his feet, Finch, seeing them both, raised his pistol, his hand trembling. But his city-bred nerves were shattered. His focus was divided between the men before him and the terrifying sounds coming from the cave. Samuel, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy rock and threw it with all his strength. It struck Finch's gun hand, and the pistol flew from his grasp, skittering across the stony ground. Finch cried out in pain and stumbled backward, away from them, away from the cave. He tripped, his feet tangling in a patch of loose shale. He fell hard, his head striking a sharp outcrop of rock with a sickening crack. Then he lay still. Silence descended on the bluffs, broken only by the fading sounds of fury from within the cave. Jedediah and Samuel stood breathing heavily, looking at the scene of sudden, brutal justice. They had not killed these men. The mountain had. Greed had led Silas into a bear's den, and fear had made Finch clumsy. These were not the laws of men, with judges and juries. This was the simple, final judgment of the wilderness. They did not linger. Jed retrieved Finch's pistol, and they started the long walk back to Three Forks Crossing. They spoke little, each man lost in his own thoughts. The truth did not need to be presented with an axe in a town meeting anymore. The truth was now written on the mountain in blood and silence. When they returned to the settlement, their story was told not in a public accusation, but in quiet, grim detail to Elias Thorne. They told him everything. Elias listened, his face growing more somber with each word. He looked at the pistol Jed placed on the counter. He looked at Samuel's bruised face and Jed's torn shirt, and he believed them. There was no need to convince the town. The town would know the truth soon enough. They would know it by the absence of Silas Blackwood. They would know it when the man from Denver was never seen again. The whispers and suspicions that had poisoned the community would die out, replaced by a quiet, sobering understanding. That evening, Jed sat with the Miller family in their small cabin. The mended wolfskin coat was draped over a chair. Sarah placed a bowl of hot stew in front of him, her hands no longer trembling with weariness, but steady with a newfound peace. Samuel sat across from him, his face tired, but his eyes clear for the first time in weeks. Young Leo, sensing the change, brought Jed the small wooden bird he had carved. He placed it in the old man's calloused hand. "For being our friend," the boy said. Jed curled his fingers around the smooth wood. He did not say much, but he ate the stew and felt the warmth of the small cabin seep into his bones. He had not sought this connection, this entanglement in the lives of others. But it had found him, and he had not turned away. He left the next morning at dawn. He did not say a long goodbye. He nodded to Samuel, who was already splitting wood with a renewed sense of purpose. He met Sarah's eyes and saw a profound, unspoken gratitude there that was worth more than any gold coin. He adjusted the mended coat on his shoulders and started up the trail. The journey back was different. The mountain felt the same. The wind whispered through the pines as it always had. But he was not the same man who had walked down it a week ago. He had gone to town to repair a tear in his coat and had been reminded of the tears that could rip through the lives of men. He had faced down greed and violence, not with strength of arms, but with the strength of his own quiet integrity and his knowledge of the wild. He reached his cabin as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted peaks. The silence that greeted him was no longer the silence of loneliness, but the silence of sanctuary. He built a fire, the familiar ritual a comfort. He took the small wooden bird from his pocket and set it on the mantel, beside the piece of steel he had failed to thread. The bird was a small, fragile thing, a piece of the world below. It did not belong here, but neither did it feel out of place. It was a marker, a reminder of a debt paid and a balance restored. Winter was coming. The first flakes of snow had already begun to fall. But as Jedediah Stone sat by his fire, wrapped in his strong, mended coat, he felt ready. He had looked into the heart of other men and had found darkness, but he had also found courage and decency. He had returned to his solitude not as an escape, but as a choice, a hard-won peace in a world that would always be torn between building and breaking. The mountain was quiet, and he was a part of its quiet, and that was enough.